Hi, it's Dennis Daly, looking at another of Daviess County's historical markers.
You know what this is? It's a historical marker. There are thousands of them all over the United States. I think I saw my first one back in the 1950s. My parents and I were in the Maryland mountains, and there was a sign that said Mr. Flint's house. Well, I didn't know much about Mr. Flint then, but I found out later George Washington slept here. Massachusetts has the biggest number of historical markers. Indiana has several hundred, and here in Daviess County there are 10. This one is nearly the farthest north. It's here in Odin, Indiana, and it's here because Odin used to have another name.
And according to the marker, the initial name was Clarksburg. Now, historians think that it was named in honor of Revolutionary War hero George Rogers Clark, the man whose troops captured the fort at Vincennes, making sure that when the new nation was formed, it could claim the West. But in the early 1880s, the old settlers changed the name to Odin. Not somehow in honor of a Scandinavian god, but they made a name out of two last names of early inhabitants. By the way, the winner of the second Indy 500, Joe Dawson, was from Odin, as well as former National Security Advisor John Poindexter.
A lot of cities used to have a former name, and Odin's old name was Clarksburg. Next, we go kind of due west from here to Elnora, Indiana, to look at a historical marker that commemorates a mode of transportation. And the historical marker here commemorates the fact that long before there were airplanes and highways and even the railroad, there were canals, and the longest in America ran right through here where this railroad is now. The marker commemorates the Wabash and Erie Canal.
And it was an epic achievement building that canal. The idea was to link the Great Lakes to the Ohio with an artificial waterway. You could get from New York to the Great Lakes on the Erie Canal, but then what do? It was more than 460 miles long, the longest ever built, actually a connection of 4 canals that cut diagonally from near Toledo down through northern Indiana to nearly into Illinois, then swinging south, and by the way, we're here, all the way to Evansville on the Ohio, providing access to the Mississippi and to New Orleans and to the rest of the world. A few sections are preserved, most are in disrepair, and railroads sit in many of the old canal right-of-ways. And it was the railroad that killed the canals. Indiana took a huge financial loss, and the slogan became, "Remember the canals."
You know, if it hadn't been for the railroad, which ironically replaced the canal and sits where it used to, it might still be here. Next, we go south to look at an American politician who made a name for himself by holding a convention in a cornfield. Back in the 1930s and 40s, if you liked really good music and you owned a tavern or a restaurant or a drugstore, you had to have a jukebox. And a man from this rural part of Indiana, Homer Capehart, became the jukebox king. He also decided to become king of something else, regional politics. So he asked all of his GOP friends one summer to come out here near this crossroads named for his family and have a picnic. It became known as the Cornfield Conference.
Sadly, there are few good photos from that conference. Farmer Capehart welcomed more than 10,000 Republicans under 40 tents for a GOP fundraiser. He glad-handed and soon became the golden boy of the Republican Party in the Corn Belt, and that eventually led him to Washington.
Homer Capehart served in the U.S. Senate, then was defeated on his fourth try by a young upstart named Birch Bayh. But it might have been Homer Capart's last campaign slogan that did him in. Back Homer again in Indiana. Next we go south to look at some forgotten pioneers. When you think of the early days of aviation, you might not think of rural Daviess County, Indiana. But back just a few years after the Wright brothers started doing their thing, a guy named Roderick Wright, good friend of the Wrights, no relation, was flying out of a grass field here. And this historical marker remembers him and the other early bird flying pioneers.
Daviess County should consider itself lucky to have such a neat little airport with a lot of electronic systems not found at other airports its size. Its main runway is more than 4,600 feet. And believe it or not, an average of 24 aircraft a day fly in and out. And old Roderick Wright, well, he had a lot of jobs with Uncle Sam, including using his nearby farm to test parachutes.
One of the neat things about this gorgeous rural airport is it doesn't have a funky airport code like some cities, RJ3. It's DCY for Daviess County. Next we go into the county seat, Washington, for 4 more historical markers. I like this historical marker for Mimi's house. It's not too far off the ground. It's easy for me to get to. It denotes a home unlike any other here in the area. And it's called Mimi's house, and it's part of a legacy here in Daviess County.
On the National Registry of Historic Homes, technically it's the Robert Cable Graham House. Built of glazed red brick in the Prairie School of Architecture, wide overhanging eaves, green Spanish tile, and mosaics. The home is a real treasure in this city. It's been the subject of many articles and tours. It's one of 2 places where there's a marker relating to the industrialist Robert Graham. By the way, it was inside the house that one of his sons, David, called a meeting to discuss the need for a new leg of interstate highway through the area. That planning session eventually would lead to I-69.
And if you think Mimi's house is neat, look behind it. The chauffeur's quarters. Room underneath for 2 Graham Page automobiles and living quarters upstairs. Next we head downtown for 2 very special places. You might say it all started right here, Fort Flora. There used to be a huge Rexall drugstore here, and next door was my dad's Montgomery Ward store. I was over there a lot. But now it's a lovely little park commemorating where the city and much of the county really started.
It's hard to believe that in the years prior to when Indiana became a state, Indian attacks were still a concern. During the War of 1812, some settlers in the Indiana Territory felt threatened, even though many fears were unjustified. Many, including those here in Daviess County, felt abandoned by Washington and built their own forts. Fort Flora is a good example. At one time, Daviess County had about 10 such forts. The historical marker on Main Street reminds us of one of those in Washington, carved out of the wilderness.
Fort Flora. You might say it was the beginning of most of all of this. Next we go just over there to a beautiful building that's an important part of my childhood. Over the decades, thousands of people came and went through this beautiful train station. It's now the headquarters of the Chamber of Commerce. I have very vivid memories of this place, and it's very special to me. One of my grandfathers was a railroader.
Originally, the tracks from Cincinnati to St. Louis were part of the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. It started before the Civil War. Eventually, Washington would not only be a passenger point, but have massive shops. They became part of the B&O. You could literally build a locomotive from scratch there. Over the years, many famous people took the shortcut rather than go through Chicago. The late President Eisenhower's funeral train stopped here to change crews. 15,000 turned out for a last goodbye.
Next, come with me out by the river for a second marker to the Graham family. Now the story of a historical marker that should actually be out here, nearer to the bridge that is named for this man, Robert C. Graham. But who besides myself is going to stop along this busy highway to read a marker? And so it's not here. The marker is here on this little connecting road between Old 50 and New 50. Kind of sad it's so inaccessible, because it talks about a family with real importance here in Daviess County.
Robert Graham was one of three brothers. They became the industrial family of the region, making some of the classiest automobiles, the Graham Page, starting and owning a huge glass company, and buying up property in downtown Manhattan. Their impact was enormous. Someone once said the Grahams were Daviess County's version of the Kennedys. Of the three brothers, certainly Robert was closest in touch with the area where he grew up. I went to school with his grandson. Oh, and one other thing. When I was in 6th grade, his grandson brought his granddad to class. He was an interesting fellow, and at one point he turned to the class and said, "Name me some nursery rhymes." Somebody said, "Mary had a little lamb." Someone else said, "Jack and Jill went up the hill." Mr. Graham grabbed 2 pieces of chalk, one in each hand, and proceeded to write the lyrics to both of those songs simultaneously. One with his left hand, one with his right.
I'm Dennis Daly. And this marker is a little hard to find. You have to know to go to the parking lot of the Baymont Motel here on the south side of Washington, Indiana. The marker commemorates the Vincennes donation lands, something not everybody has heard about, and those who have heard about it sometimes don't understand it.
When I was a kid, the historical marker was on Old US 50 west of town. It remembers an incident most people have forgotten. In 1788, Congress remembered that many original settlers were French. The new government took most of their claims, so in 1788, Congress decided to give 400 acres in 160 plots back to French families, all of it at 45-degree angles to north. Today, many French names survive. Many county roads, especially those in Knox County, still run at an angle.
And next, we go to the farthest south historical marker in Daviess County. It commemorates the life and death of a very patriotic man during the Civil War. Our trek around Daviess County to find the 10 major historical markers ends here, about 7 miles south of Washington, Indiana, at the old Ebenezer Cemetery. There was a marker here to commemorate a man who was a Civil War hero. But as a reward, he got not a badge, but a bullet.
Eli McCarty is certainly one of the county's most interesting war heroes. During the Civil War, he set up an entire regiment of Indiana volunteers and became its captain. He was wounded and sent home and took a civilian job as a draft officer. It was his job to serve draft notices. After notifying several men they had to report, late one night McCarty was ambushed and killed. The assailants were later arrested and found guilty.
Well, the marker to commemorate the life and death of Eli McCarty may be gone. I've been told one of the historical societies is keeping it for safekeeping after they found it. We don't know who took it down. But this cemetery has a special place in my heart. When I was a kid, my next door neighbor was Mr. Wilson. I know, Dennis the Menace and Mr. Wilson. The kids wouldn't let me live it down. Mr. Wilson ran this cemetery and commissioned me when I was about 10 or 12 to do a new sign for it. That's not it. My sign's been long gone, but a little bit of my childhood is here. Thanks for going along. I'm Dennis Staley.